I'm Gelsinger Cruz. I'm originally from New York, though I lived in Pennsylvania for about 30 years. In some ways, I'm an unusual person to be an ordained Presbyterian. All my grandparents were either Catholics or Jews, but we know the scripture said the Spirit blows where it will. My wife gives her apologies for not being able to join us this morning, but she's a bit unwell. I want to thank everyone who greeted me and for the warm welcome and for making it easy to participate in your worship. And let's all also give thanks to our wonderful choir and instrumentalists today. This is a beautiful fall day, but we know following fall comes winter. And if you're like me, winter is not one of my favorite seasons. I'm at the age where it's a little awkward to shovel snow. And we can look at the change of seasons as a metaphor for our lives, that there is springtime, summer, harvest, and winter. And sometimes it's difficult to say how we should react to difficult circumstances. Let us look briefly at the scriptural readings, and then I'll continue to express what the Holy Spirit has led me to talk about. In Psalm 11, verse 4 says, referring to God, "He has gained renown for his wondrous deeds. The Lord is gracious and merciful." And then in verses 7 and 9 say, "The work of his hands are faithful and just. All his precepts are trustworthy. He is established forever and ever to be performed with faithfulness and uprightness. He has sent redemption to his people. He has commanded his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name." So that particular psalm is very upbeat. It stresses how God in history has provided for his people, and that his precepts are meant to guide us, and that he is faithful. So even when we feel down and out, we can look forward to his blessing in the future. Some of the other psalms are not as positive. Sometimes they talk about the fact that the author's been praying for a while and there seems to be no answer. God seems to be involved in radio silence. Other times it talks about how the wicked prosper and in fact they intend to do me in. So I like the Psalms because I think they're honest. They say how a person really feels in their relationship with God. Too often in many churches, when we're asked how we are, what is the one acceptable word that we use to say? Fine, yes. But if we're honest, we're not always fine. And now we're not intended to share everything with everybody we greet, but I think the Psalms do give us a sort of a method that we can acknowledge there are times when we are really soaring and things are going quite well. And yet there are other times when we feel like we're in great difficulty. We may be praying to God about ill health, or about looking for a new job, or having a better relationship with a family member, and yet there doesn't seem to be much change. But the issue for us is to remember that God's sense of time and ours is very different. And I'm typical of people brought up in the New York area. Patience is not my best virtue. And then God has a sense of humor. He put me in a ministry where I'm heavily involved with secular people and interfaith families. So you have to be patient as you answer your questions and concerns. Let's look at the story in Luke, and least you think I just opened the Bible to see where it would fall for today's sermon. These are actually for today's lectionary. They are 2 of the 4 readings. And it's very interesting how the different readings sort of hang together, at least in my estimate. The The story of Jesus cleaning the 10 lepers. One of the things that should strike you is the fact that Jesus said it's only the Samaritan who returns. Now, it's hard for us as Americans, living in the 21st century to really understand what that means. But that would be the equivalent if you were at a town hall meeting and you heard the only one who paid his taxes is the drug runner. So, or if you remember the 1950s when there was great fear of the Soviet Union in the United States, it was like saying the only one who's really listening to the government is a communist. So it really, the Jewish people at the time of Jesus really had a great antagonism to Samaritans. And most of you can recall the story of the Good Samaritan. And Jesus does give zingers sometimes to his audience to make sure they're listening and to try and penetrate what they're thinking about. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, he mentions that a man is beaten up and left to die by robbers, and that a priest and a Levite, meaning two clergy in fact, pass by on the other side and do nothing. So who comes along and actually helps the man? A Samaritan. So that is a lesson for us, that God's grace sometimes comes to us in unexpected ways. We need to be careful how we judge other people, not only on their appearance or their ethnicity or the language that they use. I do want to stress something else about the cleaning of the 10 lepers. If you had been dealing with a chronic illness for a long time, well, let's back up a little bit. Leprosy at this time was an incurable and horrible disease. Because you didn't have good nerve sensations, you would bang into things or you'd burn yourself, and eventually you would lose your limbs. It was highly contagious, and the rule in the Middle East at this time was that if you were diagnosed as having leprosy, you could not live in the village, you could not live with your family. You had to live on the outskirts, because the fear was that you would contaminate other people. And the rule was you were supposed to actually have a little bell or shout if somebody came close, so they would at least have warning. But these lepers all cried out to Jesus for healing. And there's a metaphor there. The story is physical healing, but we know that each of us needs healing in some ways, whether it's physical, emotional, or financial. And Jesus is merciful, and he does heal the 10. The rule given in the Old Testament that if a leper thought he was cured of disease, which rarely happened, he was to go to the temple and show himself to the priest, and then they would make a decision whether they agreed with him or her, and then he could be returned to his family. Now, if you had been separated from your family for a long time and suddenly could return, what do you think your state of mind would be? I would suggest that it's not so much ingratitude that affects the other 9. Rather, they are like us, living in 21st century America. They are too busy. They have so much on their mind. They are so eager to see their family that they prioritize that instead of returning to give thanks to the person who cured them. And there's the old cliche, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. A lot of times, we need to call up our cousin who was widowed, but we're so busy we never get to it. We intend to take a meal over to the shut-in, but we have to stay late at work, so we never get to that. And the interesting thing, in the other Samaritan illustration I referenced, that there are some commentators who say the priest and the Levite were so focused on their religious duties that they really didn't notice the guy, even though the guy We can be so focused on legitimate needs. We have family members to take care for. Many of us have jobs. Some people are in the sandwich generation where they have to take care of both their elderly relatives and also their children. And so we can get distracted. And I would say that that's probably one of the ways of looking at the 9 people who did not return to Jesus to offer thanks. But, as we read in the Psalm, his precepts are a blessing. So we are called to mindfulness, to not be so busy that we are distracted from doing good. Excuse me. Well, today is a beautiful day. There are times when the weather seems to be our enemy. I have relatives, a fair number of relatives who live in Florida, and the last few years, the hurricanes have been a difficult matter. I had one aunt who's lived in the same place for over 20 years. Until recently, she never had to be evacuated. We also have other scary things in the world today. If you follow the economic news, there's danger of a trade war with China. And then next year is an election year, and we know there'll be claims and counterclaims from each party, some more honest than others. So we don't live in a world where we can put away all worry. But I would say the scriptures teach us that we should be balanced. We should not be like Pollyanna and think everything's always going to turn out good just because we would like that. On the other hand, we're called also not to be like sort of the John Wayne stiff upper lip person and pretend that whatever happens is not going to affect us. In the Bible, the people present both joy and sorrows, and they're realistic about that. How many of you celebrate Thanksgiving? Okay, most of you know that it's based on the Pilgrims, who were people who were really seeking to follow God, giving thanks for their first good harvest in Massachusetts after coming from England and living through a very severe winter, during which many people died. How many of you know that the Pilgrims also had fast days? Okay. Yeah, before an election, or if a harvest were not too good, they would have a fast day. It's easier to emphasize the happy things, but if we're realists, we know that sometimes the cup is half full and sometimes it's half empty. And I would say that's what the scriptures are calling us to do, to be realists, not to be overly optimistic, but not to be pessimists either. So what do you think? How can you be realistic about how the Lord is blessing you or intends to bless you in the future? I would say one thing you need is patience. The scriptures teach that the Lord's sense of timing is different than ours. Particularly as people who live in the era of technology, we're used to getting everything sort of instantly. We want to call Amazon today and have the package arrive tomorrow. But a lot of times life doesn't work that way. If we have to rebuild a relationship with our sister or brother, it's not going to be instantaneous. It's going to take some time. And I would say that is a more realistic approach. We know that the scriptures teach, and today's psalm mentioned it, that God is good, that his precepts are a blessing for us. Elsewhere in the psalm says the description of God's law as sweeter than the honeycomb, meaning it should be a guide for how we live. We often stress that God is love, but we know sometimes we don't feel like we're being loved. We may be dealing with a chronic disease. We may be dealing with a dispute with our neighbor. But we need to take the long view to realize that ultimately all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. When I was a very young child, my dad took me to the zoo, and he ran a restaurant and he didn't take that much time off. So at that age, I didn't really get to spend that much time with him. He went to work in the late morning and didn't get home until midnight, and I was obviously sound asleep most of the time he got home. When we got to the zoo, I enjoyed seeing some of the different animal exhibits, and then it was lunchtime, and my father took me to the picnic grove in the back of the zoo, and then he went to the concession stand to buy food. However, there was such a long line that the line wound around the side of the concession stand, and I couldn't see where he was. And as a 5-year-old, it seemed like he was gone a long, long time. I started to cry, and my father did return and was upset that I was upset. And I think we're often like that. We can be like the 5-year-old whose parent is out of sight. But we need to cling to the idea that God does love us, he will bless us, and that along the way there may be bumps, but that ultimately we are his children and under his care. Yesterday was a very interesting day for my wife and myself. We went to a funeral at 10 a.m. The mother of a long-term friend of mine. And the minister who led the service began by saying, "We are gathered together to witness to the sure and present hope of the resurrection." The idea that God has called us to be his children and that he loves us. And that even if we experience death today, we know that ultimately we will be raised to glory. And then 4 hours later, only a few miles away, we went to the 90th birthday party of a good friend. And it was a very interesting time because she had been a school teacher. She also had a large family, and everybody knew her as Mama Jo or Aunt Josephine. And it was interesting to hear over her long life how she had blessed so many people. Not in extraordinary ways. I mean, she's not a millionaire, so she didn't give anybody $100,000. But she was always there to help family members during a crisis, if someone was ill, if someone lost a job. She was also a piano teacher. So she got to train children to express themselves, both their joys and sorrows. And I would say that that experience of a funeral in the morning and feasting in the afternoon is something that we see in the scriptures. That we know that we experience both joys and sorrows. The scriptures say that the rain falls on both the just and the unjust. But we know, regardless of circumstances, that God is calling us to his kingdom in glory, and that we will be blessed as his children. And all God's people said, Amen.